Corinth breathed slowly that day, like an old cat in the sun. The 4th century before our era spilled across the city like warm honey at midday, and even the stones seemed to yawn with contentment. Somewhere in the distant part of town, where the streets lost their confidence and became paths, and paths became merely the intention to walk somewhere, stood a modest tree. It was an olive tree, ordinary as morning porridge, but with that particular charm possessed by things that simply exist without trying to make an impression. Its branches spread as if it had once stretched and forgotten to lower its arms. Beneath this tree, on an old, worn carpet that remembered times when Corinth was younger, sat a philosopher. His name was Dionysius, though friends, had he possessed any friends, might have called him simply Dio. But he had no friends, only one student, and even that one had come here more from curiosity than from any genuine thirst for wisdom. The student was called Telemachus, and he possessed that particular ability to ask questions precisely when the answer was becoming obvious on its own. Dionysius sat cross-legged, observing the world with that gaze that appears in people after 40, when they finally understand that there is truly nowhere to hurry to. His beard, neither particularly long nor remarkably short, had achieved that perfect state of philosophical dishevelment, not unkempt enough to suggest madness, not tidy enough to imply vanity. It was, one might say, a beard that had found its calling. The afternoon sun filtered through the olive leaves in a way that would have inspired poets, had any poets been present. But there were no poets, only Dionysius, Telemachus, and 2 goats who had wandered into the scene as goats do, with complete confidence and no apparent purpose. "Master," said Telemachus, settling himself on the ground with the elaborate care of youth trying to appear comfortable with discomfort, "what is the nature of truth?" Dionysius continued to gaze at nothing in particular. A small ant was making its way across his left sandal. His right sandal, mysteriously, was nowhere to be seen, though this seemed to concern him no more than it concerned the ant. "Truth," said Dionysius finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about such things, "is like a sandal." Telemachus waited. The goats waited too, though for different reasons entirely. One of them had discovered something fascinating about the bark of the olive tree and was conducting what appeared to be a thorough philosophical investigation of its own. "In what way, master?" prompted Telemachus, who had learned that philosophers often required encouragement to complete their thoughts, much like old donkeys required encouragement to complete their journeys. "Well," said Dionysius, wiggling his bare toes thoughtfully, "you spend most of your life looking for it, and when you find one, you immediately lose the other." This observation hung in the warm air like incense, or perhaps like the smell of baking bread from the distant bakery, which was actually what they were smelling, though neither mentioned it. The human nose, Dionysius had often reflected, was a democratic organ. It reported all scents equally, leaving the mind to sort philosophy from fresh bread, which was sometimes more difficult than one might suppose. The first goat, having completed its investigation of the tree bark, turned its attention to Telemachus's himation. The garment was a pleasant shade of blue that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, which made it perfect for a student, neither too current to suggest frivolity nor too outdated to imply poverty. The goat, however, cared nothing for fashion. It cared only for the way the fabric moved in the breeze, which it found hypnotic. "But, master," said Telemachus, gently discouraging the goat with a gesture that suggested long experience with such interruptions, "surely truth is more permanent than footwear?" Dionysius smiled, though whether at the question or at the sight of the second goat, which had begun to contemplate Telemachus with the intense focus of a critic examining a questionable work of art, was unclear. "My dear Telemachus," he said, "permanence is a myth invented by people who have never owned goats." This seemed profound, though Telemachus wasn't entirely certain why. He had learned to nod thoughtfully at such moments, which he did now, while keeping one eye on the goat that was still studying him with unnerving attention. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky, indifferent to philosophy, goats, or missing sandals. Somewhere in the distance, a potter's wheel turned with rhythmic contentment, and the sound drifted to them like a lullaby. A dog barked once, then apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort and returned to whatever dogs do when they're not barking. Dionysius shifted slightly, Not from discomfort but from that peculiar restlessness that comes when one is perfectly comfortable and slightly suspects that something should be done about it. His bare foot encountered something warm and soft, the missing sandal, which had somehow worked its way beneath him during his contemplations. "Ah," he said with satisfaction, slipping his foot into the wayward footwear. "Truth reveals itself to those who do not seek it too earnestly." "Did you just find your sandal by sitting on it?" asked Telemachus. "I prefer to think," said Dionysius gravely, "that my sandal found me." The goats, having apparently reached some sort of consensus about the philosophical merit of the assembled humans, began to wander away with the same purposeful aimlessness with which they had arrived. Their departure left a curious emptiness in the afternoon air, the way the cessation of any familiar sound, even one barely noticed, can suddenly make silence seem profound. Telemachus watched them go with something approaching regret. He had grown fond of their presence, the way one grows fond of the sound of rain on the roof or the distant murmur of market voices. They had been part of the afternoon's texture, like the dappled sunlight and the scent of olive leaves warming in the sun. "Master," he said, "why do you think the goats came?" "Perhaps," said Dionysius, examining his recovered sandal with the attention usually reserved for sacred texts, "they heard we were discussing truth and came to see if we were any good at it." "And what do you think they concluded?" Dionysius considered this question with the gravity it deserved. In the distance, the potter's wheel had stopped, leaving only the whisper of wind through leaves and the faint sound of someone practicing scales on a lyre, badly. "I believe," he said at last, "they found us adequate." This seemed to satisfy both student and teacher, though for entirely different reasons. The afternoon settled around them like a comfortable old blanket, worn thin in places but still perfectly serviceable. Time moved as it always did in such moments, not forward or backward, but deeper, like wine soaking into bread. The olive tree rustled softly above them, its leaves turning silver sides to the breeze in that way olive trees have done since olives were invented. Neither man spoke, but it was not the silence of those who have nothing to say. It was the silence of those who have said enough for now, and are content to let the world continue its ancient conversation with itself. And in that comfortable quiet, with the sun beginning its slow consideration of where it might like to set, and the shadows growing longer and more philosophical by the moment, the afternoon held them both in its warm, patient hands. The silence stretched between them like a cat in the sun, luxurious and purposeful. Dionysius had discovered that his stomach was beginning to conduct a quiet philosophical debate of its own, something about the relationship between existence and sustenance, expressed in the ancient language of gentle rumbling. "Telemachus," he said, without opening his eyes, "what is your understanding of hunger?" The young man shifted on his portion of the worn carpet, which had developed a small but persistent wrinkle that seemed determined to make itself known to his left hip. He had been contemplating this wrinkle for some time, finding in it certain metaphysical properties that he suspected might be important, though he couldn't quite grasp why. "I suppose," said Telemachus carefully, "it is the body's way of reminding the soul that it lives in flesh." Said Dionysius, a sound that contained volumes of qualified approval. "And what does your body tell you now?" Telemachus consulted his interior wisdom and found it remarkably clear on this particular point. "It tells me," he said, "that we have been sitting here long enough for the sun to move considerably, and that perhaps we should consider the question of afternoon refreshment." "Ah," said Dionysius, opening one eye to regard his student with something approaching pride. "You begin to understand the deeper mysteries." They rose from their positions with the elaborate care of men who had been sitting still for philosophical lengths of time. Joints made small protests, muscles offered gentle complaints, and various body parts requested conferences about the wisdom of sudden movement. This was, Dionysius reflected, one of the few drawbacks to the contemplative life, the body's tendency to interpret deep thought as an invitation to fall asleep. The olive tree released them from its shade with what seemed like reluctance, as if it had grown accustomed to their presence and found their departure slightly disappointing. The afternoon light fell across them with renewed intensity, reminding them that the world beyond the tree's canopy still existed and was conducting its business with typical worldly efficiency. "Master," said Telemachus as they began to walk toward the distant promise of the city proper. "Where shall we seek this refreshment?" Dionysius considered this question while simultaneously considering the way his left sandal had developed a small stone somewhere in its depths, not large enough to cause real discomfort, but persistent enough to make each step a tiny meditation on the nature of minor annoyances. "There is," he said, "a small tavern near the potter's quarter where the wine is honest and the bread remembers what wheat is supposed to taste like." They walked in companionable quiet, their footsteps falling into the rhythm that men develop when they have nowhere urgent to be. The path led them past a small shrine to Hermes, where someone had left a handful of wildflowers that were beginning to wilt in the heat. A lizard emerged from the shrine's shadow, regarded them with the cool assessment of a creature that had seen many philosophers pass this way, and disappeared again with liquid grace. "Master," said Telemachus, pausing to remove his own shoe and shake out what appeared to be a small pebble of remarkable persistence, "why do you think the simple things, walking, eating, sitting, seem so much more significant when we talk about them?" Dionysius stopped walking and looked at his student with the expression of a man who has just heard someone ask exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. "Because," he said, settling onto a convenient stone that seemed to have been placed there for just this purpose, "we spend so much of our lives doing these things without thinking about them that when we finally pay attention, it's like seeing color for the first time." A small procession passed them as they sat, a woman carrying a basket of figs, followed by a small boy with a wooden hoop, followed by a dog with no apparent connection to either but a strong sense of where he belonged in the universe. The woman nodded to them with the automatic courtesy of people who recognize fellow travelers on the road of existence, however different their journeys might be. "The figs look excellent," observed Telemachus. "They do indeed," agreed Dionysius. "Notice how she carries them, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Each fig represents someone's afternoon pleasure, someone's small moment of sweetness in an ordinary day." "Should we have bought some?" "The desire for figs," said Dionysius gravely, "is different from the need for figs. We desire them because they looked beautiful. We would need them only if we were truly hungry for figs specifically, rather than simply hungry in general." Telemachus pondered this distinction while watching the woman disappear around a bend in the path, her basket swaying gently with her stride. The boy with the hoop had stopped to investigate something fascinating in the dust, while the dog sat nearby in that patient way dogs have when they know that human curiosity must be allowed to run its course. "But, master," said Telemachus, "how does one distinguish between desire and need?" "Time," said Dionysius simply. "Desire changes like weather. Need persists like stone." As if to illustrate this point, his stomach chose that moment to make another gentle observation about the passage of time and the corresponding passage of the last meal into memory. The sound was small but audible, and somehow philosophical in its own right. "And at this moment?" asked Telemachus, hiding a smile. "At this moment," said Dionysius with dignity, "I find myself in the interesting position of discovering that my need for sustenance has achieved the persistence of stone, while my desire for that particular tavern's bread has intensified to the point of resembling weather, specifically, the kind of weather that demands immediate attention." They resumed their journey with renewed purpose, though still without haste. The sun continued its deliberate arc across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic conversation with hot metal. The sound carried clearly in the still air, adding percussion to the afternoon's gentle symphony. "Master," said Telemachus as they walked, "do you ever wonder what the goats think about all day?" Dionysius considered this question seriously, as he considered all questions that had to do with the inner lives of other creatures. "I suspect," he said finally, "that they think about much the same things we do, where the next meal is coming from, whether that shadow looks comfortable, why humans make such complicated business out of simple things. Do you think they're happier than we are?" "I think," said Dionysius, pausing to examine a particularly interesting cloud formation, "they're differently happy. We complicate our happiness by thinking about it. They simplify theirs by living it." The tavern appeared ahead of them like an answer to a question they hadn't quite finished asking. It was a modest establishment, The kind of place that had been serving bread and wine to travelers and locals for so long that it had become part of the landscape, as natural and necessary as the well beside it. The afternoon light fell across its entrance in golden bars, and from within came the comfortable sounds of earthenware and conversation, the clink of cups and the murmur of people taking their ease in the gentle hours between work and evening. "And here," said Dionysius, inhaling the promising aromas that drifted from the tavern's interior, "we shall discover whether our philosophical discussions have prepared us for the ultimate test." "Which is?" asked Telemachus. "The test," said Dionysius solemnly, "of whether wisdom tastes better with bread or with wine." And with that profound question hanging in the warm air between them, they stepped from the brightness of the afternoon into the cool, welcoming shadows of the tavern. The tavern embraced them with that particular combination of cool air, warm humanity, and the accumulated aromas of 1,000 meals that had found their proper destiny. It was the sort of place where the walls had absorbed so many conversations that they seemed to hum quietly with wisdom, gossip, and the occasional philosophical insight that emerged from the marriage of wine and contemplation. The tavern keeper, a woman of middle years whose face suggested she had heard every possible human story at least twice, looked up from her task of arranging clay cups with the precision of someone who understood that even the smallest rituals mattered. Her name was Corinna, though most patrons simply called her the one who knows where everything is, which was both accurate and respectful. "Philosophers," she said, not as a greeting but as a statement of observed fact, the way one might say clouds or afternoon. There was no judgment in it, merely recognition. "Guilty," admitted Dionysius cheerfully, settling onto a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by countless other seekers of refreshment and truth, though we prefer to think of ourselves as professional questioners of obvious things. "Same thing," said Corinna, producing 2 cups as if by magic. "Wine or water?" "What is the philosophical difference?" asked Telemachus, who was still learning to navigate the complex etiquette of tavern discourse. Corinna paused in her cup arranging to give him the look she reserved for questions that were either very profound or very foolish. She had learned that these were often the same thing. "Water," she said, "tells you things as they are. Wine tells you things as they might be, should be, or once were in a dream you had after eating too much cheese." "Wine, then," said Dionysius without hesitation. "We've had quite enough of things as they are for one afternoon." The wine, when it arrived, was the color of pomegranates and sunset, with that honest taste that suggested the grapes had lived full lives before achieving their current, more liquid form of existence. It was neither the best wine in Corinth nor the worst, but rather the most truthful. It tasted exactly like what it was, without pretensions or apologies. "And bread?" inquired Corinna, though she was already moving toward a basket covered with clean cloth. "Bread," said Dionysius, "is always the answer, regardless of the question." The bread, when unveiled, proved to be one of those minor miracles that occur when flour, water, and human attention combine in exactly the right proportions. It was brown and substantial, with a crust that promised satisfaction and a crumb that suggested the baker understood the difference between mere sustenance and actual nourishment. "Perfect," murmured Telemachus, tearing off a piece and discovering that it was still faintly warm. "Perfect," agreed a voice from the next table, "is a dangerous word." They turned to see a man of indeterminate age sitting alone with his own cup of wine and what appeared to be the remnants of a meal that had been approached with serious intent. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about things while walking long distances. "Dangerous?" asked Dionysius, with the polite interest of one philosopher encountering another in the wild. "It suggests," said the stranger, "that improvement is no longer possible. That the thing in question has achieved its final form and need never change again." "But surely," said Telemachus, "some things achieve perfection? This bread, for instance, could hardly be improved." The stranger smiled, an expression that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this observation. Could it not be warmer? Could the grain not have been grown in better soil, under more favorable skies? Could the baker not have sung while kneading, thus infusing it with additional joy? Corinna, who had been listening while wiping down cups with the focused attention of someone who heard philosophy discussed in her establishment on a regular basis, snorted softly. Could have, should have, might have, she said. The bread is what it is. We eat it now, or we don't eat it now. Tomorrow there will be different bread, made by the same baker who may or may not sing, depending on whether his wife has spoken kindly to him that morning. This observation settled over the small gathering like dust settling after a brief wind. The stranger raised his cup in acknowledgement of a point well made, while Dionysius and Telemachus continued to consume their allegedly imperfect bread with what appeared to be considerable satisfaction. You see, said Dionysius to his student, this is why taverns are excellent places for education. Here, philosophy must prove itself against practical experience. And how does it fare? Asked Telemachus. About as well as you'd expect, said Corinna, refilling their cups with the casual authority of someone who had seen many philosophical theories tested against the simple reality of hunger and thirst. A comfortable silence fell over them, punctuated only by the soft sounds of eating, drinking, and the distant murmur of the city going about its late afternoon business. Through the tavern's single window, the light had taken on that golden quality that made everything, the dusty street, the opposite buildings, even the stray dog investigating something in the gutter, look as if it had been painted by an artist who specialized in contentment. Master, said Telemachus eventually, what do you think we've learned today? Dionysius considered this question while contemplating the way the wine caught the light in his cup, creating small amber windows into depths that seemed to promise answers to questions he hadn't yet thought to ask. We've learned, he said slowly, that truth may be like a sandal, always being lost and found. We've learned that goats may be better philosophers than we are, because they don't worry about being philosophers. We've learned that the distance between hunger and satisfaction is exactly the length of a pleasant walk with good conversation. And we've learned that the word perfect makes tavern keepers snort, which is perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. The stranger at the next table raised his cup again. To imperfect bread, he said, and honest wine, and the kind of afternoon that refuses to hurry toward evening. To questions that answer themselves, added Dionysius. To students who ask the right questions at the wrong time, contributed Telemachus. To philosophers who eat bread instead of just talking about it, concluded Corinna. They drank to all of these things, and to several others that occurred to them as the afternoon light continued its slow, inevitable transformation into something that might, eventually, consider becoming dusk. The tavern held them all in its ancient embrace, philosopher and student, stranger and keeper, questions and answers, and the comfortable spaces between them. Outside, the world continued its eternal business of being the world. Inside, for people shared bread and wine and the peculiar intimacy that comes when strangers discover they are all, in their different ways, trying to make sense of the same beautiful, impossible, perfectly imperfect existence. And in that warm, wine-scented sanctuary, with the golden light painting everything in shades of contentment, the third part of their unhurried day found its own gentle conclusion. Time in the tavern moved with the peculiar fluidity of honey poured from a great height, visible in its progress, inevitable in its destination, but somehow divorced from any sense of urgency. The afternoon light that had been golden began its slow alchemy toward amber, then toward the deep orange that painters spend lifetimes trying to capture and never quite manage. The stranger at the neighboring table had introduced himself as Xenophanes, a name that carried with it the weight of considerable walking and thinking, often simultaneously. He was, he explained, in the business of collecting stories, not the grand epic kind that bards sang about heroes and gods, but the smaller, quieter stories that happened to ordinary people during ordinary afternoons when they thought no one was paying attention. Like this afternoon, he said, gesturing with his cup toward the assembled company. Here we have a philosopher who finds wisdom in lost sandals, a student who asks questions that answer themselves, and a tavern keeper who understands that bread must be eaten rather than perfected. This is the kind of story that never gets told, because everyone assumes it's too simple to matter. But does it matter? Asked Telemachus, who had reached that pleasant stage of philosophical discourse where questions seemed to generate themselves spontaneously. Everything matters, said Corinna, settling into the fourth chair at their table with the natural authority of someone in her own establishment. The question is whether we notice that it matters. She had brought with her a small bowl of olives, not the kind that merchants charged premium prices for, but the humble, honest olives that grew on trees like the one under which Dionysius and Telemachus had spent their morning. Each olive was a small, perfect embodiment of what it meant to be an olive, without pretension or apology. "These olives," said Dionysius, selecting one with the careful attention of a man choosing a philosophy, "have achieved what we spend our lives seeking." "Which is?" asked Xenophanes. "Complete authenticity. This olive has never tried to be a grape, or wondered if it should have been a figure. It simply fulfilled its olive nature with absolute commitment." "Easy enough," said Telemachus, "when you're an olive. They don't have to make choices about what kind of olive to be." "Don't they?" asked Corinna, raising an eyebrow. "This olive chose to ripen when it did, to fall when it was ready, to be picked by the person who picked it. Every moment of its existence was a choice to continue being an olive rather than giving up and becoming something else." The conversation paused while they all contemplated the philosophical implications of olivehood. Outside, the sounds of late afternoon Corinth drifted through the window, the calls of vendors beginning to pack up their wares, the laughter of children whose mothers were starting to think about evening meals, the distant bark of a dog who had something important to say about the approaching sunset. "Master," said Telemachus, "what do you think we should do now?" It was the kind of question that could have meant anything. What to do about the growing lateness of the hour, what to do about their philosophical discussions, what to do about the fact that the wine had created a pleasant buzzing in their heads that made ordinary thoughts seem suddenly profound. Dionysius considered the question while watching a single olive pit roll slowly across the wooden table, following some invisible slope that only it could perceive. "I think," he said finally, "we should do what feels appropriate to the moment, rather than what we think we should do." "And what feels appropriate?" "Walking," said Dionysius. "Slowly, with no particular destination in mind." Xenophanes nodded approvingly. "The best kind of walking. The kind where you might discover something you weren't looking for." "Or," added Corinna, beginning to clear the empty cups with movements that suggested long practice in the art of gentle efficiency, "where you might discover that what you were looking for was actually the walking itself." They rose from the table with the measured care of people who had spent time in serious contemplation of both philosophy and wine. The tavern released them reluctantly, the way warm rooms always release their occupants into the cooler air of approaching evening. "How much do we owe you?" asked Dionysius, reaching for the small purse that hung at his belt. Corinna waved a hand dismissively. "Philosophers pay in conversations," she said. "You've given me enough material to think about for several days. That's worth more than coins." "But surely—" "The bread was getting old anyway," she said firmly. "And the wine was happy to be drunk by people who appreciated it. Money is useful, but appreciation is rare." Outside, the world had taken on that particular quality of light that makes even the most familiar places seem touched with magic. The shadows were longer now, more complex, creating small pools of coolness between the buildings. The air carried scents of cooking fires and evening flowers, and somewhere in the distance, a flute player was practicing scales with the patient persistence of someone who understood that mastery came through repetition, not inspiration. They walked together, philosopher and student, story collector, and the afternoon that had brought them together, with no particular hurry and no specific destination. Their footsteps fell into a comfortable rhythm, punctuated by occasional observations about the way the light fell across certain doorways, or the philosophical implications of a cat that watched them pass with the serene confidence of a creature that had solved all the important problems of existence. "Xenophanes," said Telemachus, "what will you do with our story?" "I'll remember it," said Xenophanes simply. "I'll remember the way the light looked when we talked about perfect bread, and the sound Corinna made when she snorted at the word perfect, and the way you asked questions that made your teacher smile. And then, somewhere else, on some other afternoon, I'll tell it to someone who needs to hear about an afternoon when nothing important happened, except that everything that happened was important." They paused at a small crossroads where 4 streets met in a confusion of possibilities. Each path led somewhere different. One toward the agora, one toward the harbor, one up the hill toward the temples, one back toward the olive tree where their day had begun. "Here," said Dionysius, "we must choose." "Must we?" asked Telemachus. "What if we simply stood here for a while and let the choice choose itself?" It was, perhaps, the most philosophical thing any of them had said all afternoon. They stood in the crossroads as the sun continued its ancient journey toward the horizon, and let the moment expand around them like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And in that expanding moment, with the day's warmth still rising from the stones beneath their feet and the first hints of evening coolness beginning to stir the air, they discovered that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that required no decision at all, only the willingness to stand still and let the world arrange itself around them. The crossroads held them in its patient embrace while the sun continued its deliberate descent toward the horizon. Around them, Corinth began its slow transformation from afternoon city to evening settlement, the subtle shift that occurred when day people started thinking about home and night people began to consider their possibilities. A small procession of ants had discovered something fascinating near Telemachus's left foot and were conducting what appeared to be a spirited debate about logistics and distribution. Watching them, Dionysius was struck by the realization that every moment contained within it countless other moments, each as complete and important as the one they were experiencing. "You know," said Xenophanes thoughtfully, "I think I understand now why stories like this one matter." "Oh," said Corinna, who had followed them from the tavern, not from any particular plan, but simply because the evening felt like the kind that should be shared rather than experienced alone. "Most stories try to convince us that meaning comes from extraordinary events, battles won, monsters defeated, kingdoms saved. But this afternoon has been entirely ordinary, and yet—" He gestured vaguely at the air around them, as if meaning were something visible that could be pointed to. "And yet it feels significant," finished Telemachus. "But I can't quite say why." "Perhaps," said Dionysius, watching the ants complete their mysterious transaction and disperse with the satisfaction of creatures who had accomplished something important, "significance isn't something that happens to a moment. Perhaps it's something we bring to it." "Like conversation," added Corinna. "The bread doesn't become meaningful because of what it is. It becomes meaningful because of how we attend to it." The sun, indifferent to their philosophical discoveries, continued its ancient work of turning afternoon into evening. The light that had been warm gold was now the color of honey mixed with copper, painting the buildings around them in shades that would exist only for these few minutes and then never again. "I should return to my inn," said Xenophanes, though he made no move to leave. "I have notes to write, stories to record." "I should check on the evening customers," said Corinna, also remaining perfectly still. "We should probably find our way home," said Telemachus to his teacher. "Probably," agreed Dionysius. None of them moved. The crossroads seemed to have cast a gentle spell that made departure feel like an unnecessary complication. They stood together in the growing amber light, for people who had been strangers that morning and were now something more, not quite friends, perhaps, but fellow travelers who had shared a small portion of the infinite journey. "Master," said Telemachus, "what do you think we learned today?" Dionysius smiled, the expression of a man who had been waiting for this question without realizing it. "We learned that goats are excellent critics of philosophy. We learned that lost sandals have their own wisdom about timing. We learned that bread is never quite perfect, and that this imperfection is itself perfect. We learned that tavern keepers understand more about truth than most philosophers, and that stories about ordinary afternoons are the most extraordinary stories of all." "And," prompted Telemachus, "and we learned that the best conversations are the ones that don't try to reach conclusions, but are content to deepen the questions." A small breeze stirred the air around them, carrying with it the sense of evening cooking fires and the sound of distant laughter. Somewhere, a mother was calling a child home for supper. Somewhere else, an old man was feeding scraps to a patient dog. The ordinary evening business of an ordinary city continued around them, beautiful in its complete lack of drama. "I think," said Corinna, "that it's time." "Time for what?" asked Xenophanes. Time to let this afternoon become a memory. She was right, of course. The perfect moment, if such a thing existed, was not meant to be held indefinitely, but to be allowed its natural completion. Like bread that must be eaten rather than contemplated, like wine that must be drunk rather than preserved, some experiences were meant to flow through life rather than be captured by it. They began to move, slowly, each toward their separate destinations. Xenophanes turned toward the inn where he would transform their shared afternoon into careful words on papyrus. Corinna walked back toward her tavern, where the evening trade would soon require her attention. Dionysius and Telemachus found themselves naturally drawn toward the path that led back to the olive tree where their day had begun. "Will we see them again?" asked Telemachus as they walked. "Does it matter?" asked Dionysius. "We've seen them completely for one afternoon. That might be enough." The olive tree, when they reached it, seemed pleased to welcome them back. The light filtering through its leaves had taken on the deep, rich quality of late afternoon, and the air beneath its canopy felt several degrees cooler than the path they had just left. Dionysius settled back onto the worn carpet with a sigh of satisfaction, like a man returning to a favorite chair. Telemachus arranged himself nearby, noting that the wrinkle that had bothered him earlier had somehow resolved itself during their absence. "So," said Telemachus, "what now?" "Now," said Dionysius, "we sit quietly and let the day settle into memory. We watch the light change and listen to the evening sounds, and we don't try to make anything significant happen." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we'll probably sit under this same tree and have different conversations about the same eternal questions, and discover new ways to be surprised by obvious things." "That sounds perfect," said Telemachus. "Perfectly imperfect," corrected his teacher. "Which is the only kind of perfect worth achieving." The sun touched the horizon as they sat in comfortable silence, painting the sky in colors that had no names but needed none. Around them, the evening settled like a gentle blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird began its tentative song. And there, under the patient olive tree, with the day's conversations settling into the quiet places of memory and the first stars beginning their ancient work of decoration, a philosopher and his student discovered that the most profound truths were often the ones that required no words at all, only the willingness to sit still and let the world be exactly what it was. The afternoon, having fulfilled its purpose with characteristic understatement, transformed itself gracefully into evening, carrying with it the memory of 2 goats, 1 lost sandal, honest bread, imperfect wine, and the kind of conversation that makes ordinary moments feel touched by something that might, if one were inclined toward such terms, be called magic. But Dionysius and Telemachus, being philosophers, preferred to call it simply Tuesday. Then